Hi, it's a Sunday evening, kind of cold outside, and just went to church. And then I came home and I'm looking at our lesson today, and it's the lesson on cathedrals. And I'm thinking, wow, I just went to church, but my church isn't like a cathedral. But I think of cathedrals, I think of worshiping God. And I think of the greatest cathedrals just being out in the midst of the wonders and creation that God has. And sometimes, even when I look from my deck, because I live clear on top of this hill, and as I look down at the river running, I think, wow, this is almost like a cathedral because it's of God's creation. But then again, when we think of cathedrals back in the Middle Ages, we think of the church, and we think of a time of building these great, great church buildings, and they called them cathedrals. Well, if we look back in time, of course, we have to look all the way back to when the church was first born in the first century, after Jesus died and rose again. Churches were illegal, so they had their worship services in secluded homes and sometimes underground in the catacombs. We found the first church that was a remodeled house in Syria, and it ended up burned down by the Persians. So it's not even there now. As time went on, then in the 300s we find Constantine making Christianity legal again. So the church ended up being the Christian religion. Gradually it became known in Rome as Catholicism, the Catholic religion. But when Constantine signed the Edict of Milan, that made Christianity legal, a great thing. But then again, Constantine, he required everyone to be Christians, even if they didn't want to be. So it got to be pretty confusing in those times. And now the Pope is the head, as we went, head of the Catholic Church, and has great power. Well, why build cathedrals? Well, they thought, in the Bible it shows that, Solomon built this great gigantic temple, and David wanted to build a house for God. So they thought, we must build a building. We have to have a place where we go to have baptisms and marriages, and then to have our daily mass. They had mass daily sometimes, or maybe at least weekly on Sunday. And so they had to build this building. So they thought in the years 1000 to 1300, they would build these huge cathedrals. And they would find the greatest intellectuals, the greatest architects, the greatest artistic geniuses, actually, to build these magnificent buildings now. It'd also be a place to bury prominent deceased people. And of course, these popes, they would like to be buried somewhere. So a lot of times they buried their popes right there in these cathedrals, which was a little bit weird, but you'd be sitting there and there'd be a tomb between you and the altar. Kind of strange, but that's the way they did it. They also housed their relics. Remember I told you relics were kind of like they would say, oh, this is a piece of Jesus' cross. They did that. And they'd say, this is the veil of Mary. They did that. I don't think that they had those pieces. So it was really crazy when they thought that this was. And then they would say, we need to build a house to put these beautiful relics in so that people can come on pilgrimages and see them. So they did that too. And then, of course, in order to build these big buildings, they would say, we need some money. If you would give towards the building project, it would give you merits on your way to heaven, to work your way to heaven. The forgiveness of sins, indulgences, which we know is not true, but they used this too so they could get people that didn't know any better to build for them, workers and laborers. They needed a lot of them, and they needed a lot of money. So the popes would set forth, instead of the crusades, they'd have the building of cathedrals. The cathedral meant, it's not just meaning a great big church, but it meant the highest seat of the Catholic bishop. But when you think of cathedral, I think the highest seat is God. And so when I look at the highest seat, it'd be God. But they built this, they had a high seat for the highest person in that area would be called a bishop or a cardinal, and then of course the Pope. And again, raising money, they would put together a chapter house to raise money, and all these people, they would put together, like, we need to get money. So these people were really good at raising money and getting money from the people. And the design, they would have to have an architect design. But the design was always quite similar. In fact, it wouldn't be like the churches we go in now. The churches were always like these huge buildings, and they would have a long they have 3 doors pointed to the west, big doors, sometimes groups of doors, but there'd be 3 different ways to get in. And as you got in, you'd come through, and as you came through, you'd come through a long aisle, and that would be the nave. They called that the nave, and it'd be the main area, and the congregation would stand then. No pews, you wouldn't sit, you had to stand the whole time. And then as the very end would come, you would see there would be where the cross would be like shaped like a cross, and where the cross was, it would be called the transepts. And there would be like that whole area, and 2 areas on the right, north and south area there for certain congregations that came, small congregations or special people that came, basically that were set there, that maybe were invited by the bishops or the cardinals or something, or maybe sometimes they had groups of families sitting there. And then there would be right in the front, there'd be an area before the altar that they could put singers, and they'd have a choir that would sing there, and behind there would be the altar. And now most of the Catholic Church, I kind of like shaped like that even today. But this would be like a huge building. They would usually face to the east because they believed that Jesus was coming from the east. So most of the buildings were styled that way. They'd have statues of the apostles and Bible characters and lots of stained glass windows. And they'd have stories on their stained glass windows from the Bible stories or stories of the saints, or just different pictures of different times or history, things they wanted to teach people, and they put it in the stained glass. Because you see, a lot of the people look at that and they think, wow, there's the picture of the cross, of Jesus going to the cross. There's a picture of Jesus raising again. There's a picture of Jesus when he was a child. Because a lot of the people back then couldn't read. And so they would look at that beautiful stained glass and they would just be in awe. And then they would see and be able to read the Bible. So they did that with many of the stained glasses. The first churches there were more Romanesque, which meant that they were more round, like pillar-like, when we see those round pillars, and a little bit shorter. But then came the time of, the Middle Ages, when they had a new style going on. It was called the Gothic style. And the Gothic style would have like huge ribbed ceilings, and then it would have very pointed arches so that they could build taller and taller and stronger. And then they had this thing called the flying buttresses. And that was right outside. Usually outside, they would build a few feet away from the wall. So it would look like when you're looking onto it that they weren't attached, and these areas were just standing in the air. It was kind of a unique way when you look at some of these big cathedrals and you think, wow, is that area even attached to the building? Of course it was. But they built this to not only just for the look, but because it made the building stronger and the walls stronger. They wanted to build the cathedrals like sometimes like they thought heaven was, and with the ceilings with pictures and artwork on the ceilings, sometimes dome ceilings with beautiful artwork. They were always symmetrical. That meant they were what would be on one side would be on the other side, so you'd feel balanced in there. They were harmonious, areas that wanted being harmony with God. They were filled with light to give glory to God. It took a lot of builders to build them. It took decades to build them sometimes. Sometimes it would take 200 years. So that means a person, maybe an architect was building, then his son would build, and then his grandson would build. It took a long time to build these huge, huge, magnificent buildings. And they didn't have like machinery and computers like we have today. So they had to have engineers to figure this out. And then they had to have stone cutters and sculptors to sculpt. They had to have mortar makers to make mortar. I can't even say that word, but that would be like cement, They had to have masons, stone builders, stone cutters, carpenters, plasterers, roofers, glassmakers, blacksmiths, laborers. Anyway, they had to have a lot of different people there. And a lot of them were paid and a lot of them were volunteering their time because they wanted to earn merits on their list on the way to go to heaven, which is really crazy. But that's what they did back then. One of the greatest Gothic cathedrals was in Notre Dame, and it was the cathedral there, and it was in Chartres. And Chartres is by Paris, and had quite a history because it was a place, first of all, and the ancient Celtic tribes lived there, and then Julius Caesar captured it in 52 BC. Then they built a church, around in the 300s. Then it was burned in 743 by a duke from Austria. And then 858, the Danish Vikings, after they rebuilt it again, the Danish Vikings came and burned it down. And then 1120, it was burned again. So in 1260 is where the current building of Notre Dame, that was the last building, and it was had the Gothic architecture and the flying buttresses. Notre Dame means Our Lady, and they believed that they had the veil of Mary there, which, who knows, very doubtful. Inside, they would have this maze inside that was all these different little circles, and if you get in this maze and you walk in these maze, it'd be like representing walking around in your life, and it also would give you merits for heaven. It was kind of weird, but they have that in there too. And they also had all these beautiful 186 stained glass windows, and 152 of them are still the originals that are there. Quite a deal. But when I think about the cathedrals, I think there's no greater cathedral than the ones that God builds. But I think of their hearts, and there were a lot of people that really wanted to hear the gospel, and they're looking for hope. And they found hope in Jesus Christ. But then there was the leaders and all of the sacraments and all of the things they'd make the people do that was crazy, the rules and regulations that's called legalism, that would take away the simple truth, like I said before. But some of those cathedrals still stand, and there's still some awe when you walk into one and see the magnificent architecture and the artist's work, and you look and you think, wow, this is pretty magnificent. But hey, someday we're going to be in heaven, and it's going to be so beautiful, and the greatest cathedral is going to be there, and there will be Jesus sitting on the throne. I can't wait.